Well, Chad, the Marshall Times hit a little bit of a speed bump for Mirco CroCop. He's supposed to come back here, fight Roy Nelson in Bellator 200 to be a alternate for the whole heavyweight Grand Prix kind of thing. That got us excited about the inevitable Fedor versus CroCop finale. I'm not saying that won't still happen, and in fact, maybe there's a even better chance that it happens now that CroCop does not have to fight Roy Nelson before he gets there.
First round injury is a
shrewd move.
It's a shrewd move in terms of the tournament game.
Yeah. It's kind of feels like a Dundasso qualified move in a lot of ways.
The question is, was he getting out the calendar, checking out when the final was going to be, trying to schedule his rehab time?
Yeah.
Be ready about 3 weeks before the final. I was going to say 6 weeks, but who are we kidding?
Now here's what we're looking at for Bellator 200 in jolly old London, England. Main event is the young vagabond, the dream catcher himself, Gegard Mousasi, against Rafael Carvalho. Then you got Michael Page, David Rickles. You got Aaron Chalmers, Ash Griffiths. You got Phil Davis, Linton Vassell. And then, it's Bellator, so a bunch of other shit.
13 prelim fights available for your viewing pleasure at ParamountNetwork.com.
Well, some of those are usually going to be post-lim events, which is always
This is not an unusual approach for Bellator. They've been doing this a lot, especially lately, just having a shitload of prelims.
Yes.
Many of which sometimes are like local people.
There to sell a few tickets and get kind of basically an audition for Bellator and make like $200.
Yeah. I guess the question is, Ben, how much steam does Bellator 200 lose, if any, with the loss of CroCop versus Roy Nelson? Were you like champing at the bit to get CroCop Roy Nelson, or is this no big deal?
Well, the old school fanboy in me is never gonna pass up a chance to see CroCop. Maybe even especially this renewed Marshall Times, where suddenly decided his body could do it after all once he was out from under UFC and USADA. I was going to watch that. However, I was also trying not to kid myself into thinking that CroCop versus Roy Nelson was going to be a good fight, especially at this point in their careers.
Even if you view it as a fun, pure kickboxing fight, it's probably nobody's getting finished there, right? I mean, you're probably looking at a 15-minute either slog or banger, depending on what these guys have going for them on the night of. I'm personally thinking, CroCop, Roy Nelson. I know it says here they're still trying to find an opponent for Roy Nelson. The event itself doesn't necessarily lose too much appeal for me with the absence of CroCop versus Roy Nelson. I mean, if you are a fan of the high-level MMA, Rafael Carvalho versus Gegard Mousasi is going to be a good one anyway.
Right, but that would have benefited from just having the name CroCop associated. Because if you look at what's been successful for Bellator, it's a lot of the old guys whose best stuff is behind them, but, the name still lives on, and you get people in the door with that, and then you hit them with Mousasi Carvalho for the middleweight championship. Now you have to kind of rely on that to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, which is a little bit of a tougher sell. Then again, though, remember that we did get excited about your boy Gegard Mousasi going over there to Bellator. Now he has basically the fight that can make it seem like, okay, Gegard Mousasi is a capital G guy in the middleweight division again, even if it's with a different organization. You can kind of remind people then, hey, he exited the UFC with a little bit of a head of steam, and he might have a claim to being the actual best middleweight in the world. Who knows? Although, if you're Bellator and you're looking at this, do you feel like you need Gegard Mousasi to win this fight?
That is an interesting question because Rafael Carvalho is good.
He is good.
He's real good. He's won 15 fights in a row. The last handful of them in Bellator, obviously, and he's the 185-pound champion there. He's got wins over Melvin Manhoff and Joe Schilling and Brandon Halsey, who I believe once said that he does everything hard, train hard, fuck hard, fight hard.
I think got the order wrong. I think fuck hard comes last.
Right, sure, yeah. But I believe it was Brandon Halsey that said that. So Rafael Carvalho is no joke, and yet he's one of those dudes. I think this will be a fun fight to watch, by the way. But Carvalho is one of those dudes where if somebody just asked you out of the blue who's the Bellator middleweight champion, you'd be like, did Mousasi win that shit yet? Yes. Right? You'd have to think about it for a second before you came up with Rafael Carvalho's name. So along the same lines of thinking that it would have helped Bellator to have CroCop on this fight card because CroCop is CroCop, I think it would help Bellator to have Gegard Mousasi as middleweight champion because he's the dream catcher.
Right. Or are you hoping like, hey, either way it goes, even if Gegard Mousasi loses, then Carvalho becomes a guy that people have to start thinking seriously about because he beat Gegard Mousasi. And that's a fair position to take because if you look at, especially as Bellator champion, his string of wins, where, if you beat Melvin Manhoff twice at this point, okay. I mean, cool. We all are going to show out to see a Melvin Manhoff fight because of the sheer explosive violence potential. But then, Alessio Sakara was not really in a position where anybody was talking about him as one of the top middleweights. So,
right, and that's the one they went over there and did in Italy.
Right. You could really use a high-profile win for a guy like Carvalho if he's going to be your guy. And then, plus, Mousasi has that thing where people feel, to some extent, rightly or wrongly, like he's a known quantity. We saw who he could beat in the UFC, who he couldn't. And if he goes over and he becomes Bellator champion, then maybe people are looking at it like, well, okay, he wasn't the best middleweight in the UFC, or at least he never actually proved that he was the best middleweight in the UFC, but he is now the best middleweight in Bellator, so it just tells you that the quality of competition is lower. But if Carvalho goes out there and smashes him, then we still don't know who could actually stand up and stop the Rafael Carvalho train.
Right. Well, Mousasi did finish his UFC career on a string of wins, right? He beat Chris Weidman, he beat Vitor, he beat Uriah Hall. He did have the loss to Jacare, the loss to Uriah Hall, Lyoto Machida during the time that he was in the UFC. But he's one of the few guys who closed it out kind of on his own terms.
Right.
And on a win streak, then came over to Bellator, beat Alexander Shlemenko. So he seems like a perfectly, you say he's a known quantity, and in some ways he is. But if he becomes Bellator 185 pound champion, I think it's sort of like a mutually beneficial relationship for both parties because it elevates Bellator because suddenly the middleweight champ is not a guy that we have to think for a while before we figure out who it is. And you get some gold on Mousasi and he looks, like one of the best 185 pound fighters in the world again. And if you're Bellator, maybe it's a question here of what kind of Mousasi fight shows up here because the young vagabond can look explosive and deadly and hand out some TKO losses, as can Rafael Carvalho. But he's also a guy who sometimes gets himself into a sort of a lackluster, almost listless sort of affair, right? He hasn't always looked like he's had that killer instinct. So I think if you're Bellator, your best case scenario is you get an absolute barn burner out of this thing. And even if Rafael Carvalho wins, maybe some people who weren't all that familiar with him have sort of a holy shit moment and he becomes a guy that then they want to come back for.
Yeah. Does this still, even with the loss of CroCop, Roy Nelson, does this still feel like Bellator 200 is a real big event?
It doesn't feel like UFC 100.
Okay.
Or UFC 200.
It also does not come with the same price tag.
No, that's true. And once again, we've got a weekend with back-to-back events, Bellator on Friday, UFC on Saturday. So it's going to be a question of how you want to spend your time, if nothing else. Ben, one more thing. I don't know if we wanted to talk about Michael Page versus David Rickles, the caveman.
Uh-huh.
It's not
still around.
Yes. Will he be the most credible opponent for MVP Michael Venom Page up to this point? I don't know the answer to that. The thing I was going to say was, I don't know if you looked down here on the prelims to notice that Charlie Ward is on this card versus Lewis King. And so I guess my question is, do we need to put an ankle monitor on Conor McGregor? Mm-hmm. Because you'll recall it was a Charlie Ward fight his last time out in Bellator where McGregor showed up wild and out. I mean, not the most wild in that we've seen him.
Yeah,
it was merely
he has since wilded.
He has since wilded harder, but up to this point, it was the most wild and out we had seen from Conor McGregor on holiday, where he slaps a Bellator cage side official and kind of shoves referee Mark Goddard. We got another Charlie Ward fight on our hands here, Ben. Are we going to put pictures of Conor McGregor in the windows? Do not let this man in.
Well, at the very least, security should be aware. Security should be made aware of the potential for some wild and out. Because don't act like there hasn't been an escalation of Conor McGregor's behavior since that incident.
An escalation of the wild and out.
That's right.
He has only wilded out harder.
I mean, this if we're following a trajectory here, he kind of has to hit somebody with an entire table at this event, right? Like, and don't even think about what happens if there's like a controversial stoppage and his guy loses or something, or his guy loses a questionable decision. Charlie Ward goes out there, loses a split decision to Lewis King that it looks like maybe he could have got. Jesus Christ. Conor McGregor will light the place literally on fire.
Yeah. Security, if you see a guy wearing a suit that says, fuck you all over it, in its pinstripes.
Get on the walkie-talkie.
Get on the walkie-talkie and
call that one in.
Circle to your right.
Also, maybe if you see somebody wearing a fur coat with like no shirt on underneath. Also, maybe something you're going to want to pay attention to.
That's going to do it for round number 2. We will be right back with round number 3.